Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. The Watcher's Light, the lighthouse, was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place of solitude where I could escape the noise of my life, the weight of my failures. 3 months on the desolate Maine coastline, just me and the rhythmic flash of the beacon. No distractions, no reminders of the divorce, the drinking, the job I'd lost, just the wind, the waves, and the steady work of maintaining the light. Pemaquid Point Lighthouse had been automated for decades, but the Historical Society still kept a keeper for the tourism season. Off-season, though, November through January. That was just me, making sure the automated systems ran properly, doing minor repairs and keeping the historical records. It was perfect. 3 months of peace before I had to figure out what came next. The first 2 weeks were everything I'd hoped for. I settled into a routine, taking long walks along the rocky shoreline during the day, reading by the fire at night. The weather was harsh, but I found comfort in the howling wind and the crash of the waves against the cliffs. The isolation was a balm to my fractured nerves. The trouble began on a Tuesday night in late November. A nor'easter had been battering the coast for hours, rain lashing against the windows of the keeper's cottage, wind threatening to tear the roof clean off. I'd checked the light earlier, making sure the backup generators were ready in case we lost power. Everything was working perfectly, the massive Fresnel lens rotating steadily, sending its warning beam out across the churning Atlantic. I was half asleep in my armchair, an empty glass of whiskey on the side table, when I heard it. A ship's horn, deep and mournful, cutting through the storm's fury. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. No ships should be this close to shore in weather like this. The charts were clear. This stretch of coastline was treacherous even in good conditions. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight and hurried outside. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I made my way to the cliff's edge. Rain stung my face as I peered out into the darkness, sweeping my flashlight across the heaving sea. And there it was, a ship maybe half a mile offshore, lights glowing dimly through the storm. It was old, not antique, but certainly not modern. The kind of fishing trawler that would have been common in these waters 30 or 40 years ago. And it was heading straight for the rocks. I ran back to the cottage, fumbling for the radio. Vessel approaching Pemaquid Point, this is the lighthouse keeper. You're on course for the shoals. Do you copy? Static hissed back at me. I tried again, more urgently this time. Nothing. Back outside, I waved my flashlight frantically, trying to signal the ship. It continued its steady approach toward the rocks, seemingly oblivious to the danger. I watched in horror, knowing what was about to happen, except it didn't. The ship should have struck the shoals, I was certain of it, but instead it seemed to pass through them. One moment it was there, lights glowing in the darkness, and the next it was gone, as if swallowed by the night itself. I stood in the rain for several minutes, searching the waves, convinced I'd see debris or hear cries for help, but there was nothing. Just the storm and the sea and the steady flash of the lighthouse beam overhead. Back inside, soaked and shivering, I poured another whiskey and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Had I imagined it? A hallucination born of exhaustion and isolation. I'd been sober for months, but maybe the stress, the single drink I'd allowed myself. I checked the logbook, scanning entries from previous keepers. Nothing about phantom ships or strange occurrences. Just routine notes about maintenance and weather conditions. I made my own entry, keeping it factual and brief. Possible vessel sighting during storm, lost visual contact, no distress signals received. Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with ghostly ships and drowning sailors calling my name. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline blue sky and a sea that sparkled innocently in the winter sunlight. I walked the shoreline for hours, searching for any sign of wreckage. There was nothing, no debris, no oil slick, no evidence that a ship had been there at all. I told myself I'd imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, the whiskey, a momentary lapse in perception. Nothing to worry about. I went about my day, checking the lighthouse systems, making minor repairs to weather damage from the storm, trying to put the incident out of my mind. That evening, I was updating the maintenance logs when I noticed something odd. Flipping back through the previous keeper's entries, I found a note from exactly 1 year ago, November 26th. Strange vessel sighted during storm. Appeared to be in distress near shoals. Coast Guard notified, found nothing. A chill ran through me. The same date, the same circumstances. I kept reading, flipping back through the years. Every November 26th, stretching back decades, contained some variation of the same entry. A mysterious ship, always during a storm, always appearing to be in danger, always vanishing without a trace. My hands were shaking as I closed the logbook. This wasn't my imagination. Something was happening here, something that had been happening for years. But what? Ghost ships weren't real. They were sailors' tales, folklore to explain the inexplicable. I spent the rest of the evening researching, using the spotty internet connection to search for shipwrecks near Pemaquid Point. There were dozens, of course. This coastline had claimed many vessels over the centuries. but one caught my attention: the fishing trawler Northern Star, lost with all hands on November 26, 1983, during a violent storm. The article included a grainy photograph of the ship. It matched what I'd seen. That night I kept watch from the lighthouse tower, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The sea was calm, the sky clear and filled with stars. No mysterious ships appeared. Just after midnight, I finally gave up and went to bed, exhausted but relieved. Whatever had happened the previous night seemed to be a once-a-year occurrence. I had 11 months before I needed to worry about it again. I was wrong. 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of that same mournful horn. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Outside, another storm raged, not as fierce as the nor'easter, but still violent enough to make the cottage windows rattle. I threw on clothes and grabbed my raincoat, telling myself I was just being thorough, that there wouldn't be anything to see. But there it was again, the Northern Star, lights glowing dimly through the rain, heading straight for the rocks. And again, just as it should have struck, it vanished. This time I was certain I hadn't imagined it. And this time, just before it disappeared, I saw something else, a figure on the deck, looking directly at the lighthouse. At me. The next morning, I called Eliza Winters, the head of the historical society that managed the lighthouse. "Ships that vanish," she laughed when I explained what I'd seen. "That's just lighthouse folklore, Daniel. Every keeper has a ghost story. But the logbooks are full of bored keepers trying to entertain themselves," she finished for me. "Look, the isolation gets to everyone eventually. It's why we usually rotate keepers more frequently. If you're struggling—" "I'm not struggling," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. "Something is happening here, Eliza." "Something real." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "There's a historian in Bristol who specializes in local maritime history. Marcus Fletcher. He has some unusual theories, but he knows more about the shipwrecks around here than anyone. I can give you his number if you want." I called Fletcher immediately. He agreed to meet me the next day at a small coffee shop in town, about 20 minutes' drive from the lighthouse. Marcus Fletcher was not what I expected. I'd imagined an elderly academic type, but the man who greeted me was in his early 40s, with sharp eyes and an intensity that was almost unsettling. He listened without interruption as I told him what I'd seen, nodding occasionally, his expression giving nothing away. "The Northern Star," he said when I finished. "You're not the first keeper to see her. The logbooks go back further," he said. "The entries about the Northern Star only start in 1984, the year after she sank. But there are similar entries about other ships going back to when the lighthouse was first built. Always the same pattern: a ship approaches the rocks during a storm, then vanishes." "Ghost ships," I said flatly, not bothering to hide my skepticism despite what I'd seen. Fletcher smiled thinly. "I prefer temporal echoes, moments of trauma so powerful they leave an imprint, replaying under similar conditions. Like a haunting, if you want to use that term, sure. But it's not just the ships that are echoes. The people who see them are part of the pattern too." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Every keeper who's reported seeing these ships has been troubled. People seeking isolation because they're running from something. People like you." I stiffened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know the Historical Society only hires off-season keepers who won't mind being alone for months. People who prefer it even, and those are exactly the kind of people who see the ships." He sat back, studying me. "What are you running from, Daniel?" I didn't answer. Instead, I asked, "Why does it matter? Why do only certain people see them?" "Because you're part of the echo. The lighthouse keeper is as much a part of the tragedy as the ship itself. Always watching, always witnessing, never able to prevent it." He paused. "Did you know 6 lighthouse keepers have committed suicide at Pemaquid Point, all during the winter months, all after reporting seeing ships that weren't there?" A cold knot formed in my stomach. "That's not in any of the materials the Historical Society provided. Of course not. Bad for tourism." Fletcher's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to scare you, but you should know what you're dealing with, these echoes. They can become overwhelming. The more you focus on them, the stronger they get, and they've been known to interact with the observers." "Interact how?" "Keepers report seeing figures on the ships looking at them, hearing voices calling their names. Some even claim to have conversations with the dead." He hesitated. "The last keeper who committed suicide back in 2010, they found him on the rocks below the lighthouse. His last logbook entry said he was joining the crew." I left the meeting with Fletcher feeling more unsettled than before. His talk of temporal echoes and suicidal lighthouse keepers seemed far-fetched, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen. And the figure on the deck, looking at me. That night, I locked all the doors and windows of the cottage, even though a part of me recognized the absurdity of trying to keep out something that might not be physically present. I didn't drink, wanting to keep my head clear. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening to the wind and waiting. Just after midnight, the horn sounded again. This time, I didn't rush outside. I went to the window and looked out. The Northern Star was there, closer to shore than I'd ever seen it, its running lights cutting through the mist that had settled over the water. And on the deck, clearly visible now, was a man in a captain's hat, looking directly at the lighthouse. At my window, he raised his hand, a clear gesture of greeting or beckoning. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't an echo or a replay of past events. This was interaction, just as Fletcher had warned. For the next week, the pattern continued. Every night, just after midnight, the Northern Star would appear, always a little closer to shore, always with the captain figure visible on deck. I started leaving the curtains closed, but it didn't matter. I could feel his presence, sense his gaze fixed on the cottage. I stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. I checked and rechecked the lighthouse equipment obsessively, ensuring the light never faltered. I began to wonder if that was the key, if the ship appeared because the light had failed somehow, if the captain was trying to warn me of some impending disaster. During the day, I researched everything I could about the Northern Star and its captain, a man named Edward Thorne. The ship had been lost with all 8 crew members during what locals still referred to as the Thanksgiving Storm of '83, one of the most violent nor'easters in recent memory. Captain Thorne had been an experienced sailor, respected in the community, with a wife and 2 young children who still lived in Bristol. I found myself driving to Bristol again, this time to the small cemetery where Thorne was memorialized. His body had never been recovered, but a stone had been placed for him alongside generations of other Thornes. As I stood before it, a voice behind me made me jump. "You're the new lighthouse keeper." I turned to find an elderly woman watching me, her eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. She was bundled against the December cold, a bouquet of winter flowers in her gloved hands. "Yes," I admitted. "How did you know? You have the look," she said simply. "That haunted expression. Edward's watching you, isn't he?" My blood ran cold. "You're Margaret Thorne, Edward's widow." She placed the flowers at the base of the stone. "Every keeper sees him eventually, some more clearly than others." "What does he want?" My voice was barely a whisper. Margaret's eyes, when they met mine, held a sadness so profound it was almost tangible. "The same thing he's always wanted, someone to save his crew, someone to change what happened. But that's impossible. It was 40 years ago. Time works differently for the dead." She adjusted her scarf against the bitter wind. "Especially those who died with unfinished business." "What happened that night, really?" Margaret was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her husband's memorial. "The official report said the lighthouse light failed during the storm. That's why the Northern Star struck the rocks, but the keeper at the time, a man named Sullivan, swore the light never went out. He maintained the equipment religiously." "Then why did the ship wreck?" Sullivan had been drinking heavily that night. He'd gotten a letter that day informing him his son had been killed in action overseas. He admitted later he might have missed something, might not have been as attentive as he should have been. She looked at me directly. "He killed himself 3 months later, walked into the sea during a winter storm, just like the keeper Fletcher had mentioned, just like 5 others before him. Edward doesn't blame Sullivan," Margaret continued softly. "Not really. But his spirit can't rest. He keeps trying to prevent the tragedy, keeps hoping for a different outcome." Her expression became troubled. "But the keepers who see him, it doesn't end well for them. The guilt becomes too much. Edward doesn't mean to harm them, but his need is overwhelming." "What should I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Leave," she said simply. "Break your contract, make up an excuse, do whatever you need to do. But get away from that lighthouse before it's too late." I didn't leave. I couldn't. Not just because I had nowhere else to go, but because something about Captain Thorne's nightly vigil had become personal to me. I understood his need to make things right, to atone for a failure that may not even have been his fault. Wasn't that what I wanted too? A chance to undo my mistakes, to be the person I should have been for my wife, my colleagues, myself. That night when the Northern Star appeared, I didn't hide. I went outside, down to the rocky shoreline, and waited. The ship was so close now I could see details I'd missed before, the peeling paint on the hull, the rust around the portholes, the name emblazoned on the bow. Captain Thorne stood at the wheel, his figure more solid, more present than ever before. He saw me. Our eyes met across the water, and then, for the first time, he spoke, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "The light," he called. "You must keep the light." "I am," I shouted back. "The light is working perfectly." He shook his head, frustration evident even from afar. "Not now, then, you must keep the light." And suddenly I understood. He wasn't warning me about a current danger, he was trying to change the past. His past, the night the Northern Star was lost. "I can't change what happened," I called to him. "It's done." "It's over, nothing is ever over," he replied, his voice somehow inside my head now. "Time is a circle for those with unfinished business. We repeat until we get it right." The ship began to fade, becoming translucent, ghostly. Captain Thorne's voice grew fainter. "Tomorrow night, the storm comes again. Keep the light, keeper, save my crew." Then he was gone, leaving me alone on the rocks with the winter wind whipping around me and a terrible understanding taking root in my mind. The next day I checked the weather forecasts obsessively. They predicted clear skies, cold but fair, no storms, no danger. Captain Thorne was wrong or delusional if a ghost could be such a thing. But as evening approached, the barometer began to fall. Clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and ice. By nightfall, the first flakes were falling, thick and fast, reducing visibility to almost nothing. A storm was coming, just as he'd predicted. I checked and rechecked the lighthouse equipment. The automated system was working perfectly, the massive lens rotating steadily, the light cutting through the growing blizzard. Backup generators were ready. Everything was as it should be, but as midnight approached, a terrible dread settled over me. This wasn't just any storm. This was the storm, the one that had claimed the Northern Star 40 years ago, replaying in some impossible loop of time and tragedy. At 11:45, the power went out. The backup generators kicked in immediately, but for just a moment, less than a second, the light faltered. A momentary darkness that no one would notice. No one except a ship already dangerously close to shore, navigating by that steady beam. The horn sounded, more urgent than before. I ran to the window. The Northern Star was there, closer than ever, heading straight for the rocks. But this time it looked different, more solid, more real. This wasn't an echo or a ghost. This was happening now. I ran to the radio. Northern Star, this is Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. You're too close to shore. Change course immediately. To my shock, a voice crackled back through the speaker. Pemaquid Point, this is Northern Star. We're caught in the current. The light, we lost sight of the light for a moment. Turn hard to port, I shouted. The shoals are directly ahead of you. Attempting to correct, the voice responded, tight with tension, but the engines are struggling against the current. I watched from the window, helpless, as the ship fought against the forces pulling it toward destruction. It was turning slowly, too slowly, and then a terrible realization hit me. The light, it needed to be brighter, stronger. The automated system was good, but it wasn't designed for conditions like this. I ran from the cottage to the lighthouse tower, taking the steps 2 at a time. At the top, I accessed the control panel and overrode the automated settings, increasing the power to the light beyond recommended levels. The beam strengthened, cutting through the snow with renewed intensity. Northern Star, the light is at maximum power now. Can you see it? We see it, the radio crackled, continuing to turn. It's going to be close. I held my breath, watching as the ship inched away from disaster, fighting the current with everything it had. For a moment I thought it would make it. Then I heard it, the terrible sound of metal tearing against rock. The Northern Star had struck the outer edge of the shoal. We're taking on water, the radio sputtered. Port side hull breach. Hold on, I said, already running back down the tower stairs. I'm calling the Coast Guard, but as I reached for the emergency phone, a strange sensation swept over me, a dizziness, a shifting of perception. The room seemed to waver, like heat rising from pavement in summer. And when it steadied again, everything had changed. The cottage was different, older looking, with different furniture. A calendar on the wall read November 1983. And sitting at the table, head in his hands, was a man I'd never seen before. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood at his elbow. He looked up, startled by my presence. Who the hell are you? I stopped, understanding washing over me in a cold wave. You're Sullivan. The keeper in 83, his bloodshot eyes widened. How do you know my name? I didn't answer. Instead, I lunged for the radio on the counter. Northern Star, this is Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. Change your course immediately. You're heading for the shoals. Sullivan stared at me like I'd lost my mind. What are you doing? There's no ships out in this storm. Trust me, I said, turning to him with desperate intensity. There is. And we need to make sure the light doesn't fail, not even for a second. Something in my voice must have convinced him. He rose unsteadily to his feet. The backup generator, it's been acting up. I was about to check it when I got distracted. He gestured vaguely at the whiskey bottle. Show me, I demanded. The generator was housed in a small shed attached to the lighthouse tower. As soon as Sullivan opened the door, I could hear it, a rhythmic knocking that suggested something was seriously wrong with the machinery. It's the fuel line, Sullivan muttered, kneeling beside the generator. Gets air bubbles in it sometimes. If it fails, the light goes out. I finished for him. Fix it. Now, while Sullivan worked on the generator, I returned to the radio, continuing to warn the Northern Star. Captain Thorne's voice came back, confused but responsive, altering his course based on my instructions. I guided him to a safer passage, away from the treacherous shoals that had claimed his ship in another timeline. And then, just as Sullivan called out that he'd fixed the generator, that strange wavering sensation returned. The room shifted around me, reality bending like light through water. When it stabilized, I was back in my own time in the cottage as I knew it. The storm still raged outside, but something had changed. The oppressive dread that had hung over me for weeks was gone. I ran to the window, searching the darkness for the northern star. There was nothing there, no ghostly ship, no captain's figure watching from the deck. Just the storm and the sea and the steady flash of the lighthouse beam. I spent the rest of the night searching through records online, looking for information about the northern star. What I found stunned me. There had been a fishing trawler by that name, captained by Edward Thorne. It had nearly sunk during the Thanksgiving storm of 1983, suffering damage after brushing against the outer shoals near Pemaquid Point. But the ship had survived, making it safely to harbor. Captain Thorne and his crew had all lived long lives afterward. The lighthouse keeper at the time, James Sullivan, had been commended for his vigilance during the storm, keeping the light burning despite equipment failures that might have plunged the coast into darkness at a critical moment. The official report noted Sullivan's extraordinary attention to duty and quick thinking in a crisis. There was no mention of Sullivan's drinking, his son's death, or his subsequent suicide. In this timeline, those things had never happened. I sat back, trying to process what had occurred. Had I actually changed the past, or had Captain Thorne somehow pulled me into his endless loop, allowing me to break it by making a different choice than Sullivan originally had? I didn't know, I still don't, but in the weeks that followed, the northern star never reappeared. The oppressive presence that had filled the lighthouse lifted, replaced by a peaceful solitude that felt nothing like the desperate isolation I'd been seeking when I first arrived. When my 3-month contract ended in January, I didn't renew it, despite Eliza's offer. It was time to move on, to face the life I'd been running from. But before I left, I made one last entry in the logbook, knowing future keepers would read it. The light is our responsibility, not just for the ships that sail now, but for those caught in storms we cannot see, in times we cannot reach. Keep the light, no matter what. Someone is always watching for it. I still visit Pemaquid Point sometimes, standing on the cliffs and looking out at the endless Atlantic. I never see the northern star. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in and visibility drops to nothing, I imagine I hear a ship's horn in the distance, not mournful now, but grateful. A salute from a captain who finally found his way home. And I wonder about the other lighthouses along this coast and the keepers who watch through the long nights. What ships do they see in the darkness? What echoes call to them across the water? What moments are they still trying to change? I keep my own light burning now, metaphorically speaking. I've rebuilt my life, reconnected with the people I pushed away, found purpose again. And on stormy nights, I still find myself drawn to windows, peering out at the darkness, watching. Always watching, because that's what lighthouse keepers do. We keep the light and we watch for those who might be lost, even if they've been lost for 40 years, even if they're only lost in time.